Ethan was just 11 years old, but life had already taught him its colder lessons. He grew up in a small, quiet orphanage tucked away on the edge of town, a place that gave him food, shelter, and a decent education. But little else. He had never known the warmth of a parent's hug or the steady presence of family. What Ethan longed for more than anything was simple, to belong to someone. And yet, despite the loneliness that followed him like a shadow, Ethan had something rare inside him, a quiet resilience, a light that refused to go out. His kindness, his optimism, and his gentle nature made everyone around him feel at ease. Even in silence, he carried hope like a flame. He'd always known his life was different. Other kids at school talked about camping trips and birthday parties, about siblings and sleepovers. Ethan had no such memories. No mother to scold him for staying up too late. No father to teach him how to ride a bike. But instead of sinking into sadness, Ethan found joy in the little things, drawing imaginary places, reading books that swept him off to distant lands, and helping the orphanage staff with whatever he could. Those small acts of kindness, they filled the empty spaces in his heart. One chilly autumn afternoon, Ethan sat at his usual window seat, sketching a cozy cottage hidden among golden trees. He was lost in his drawing when something outside caught his eye. A well-dressed man was walking up the gravel path, his long black coat swaying, polished shoes gleaming, and a leather briefcase in hand. Ethan had never seen anyone like him around here. He watched as the man spoke briefly with the head caretaker, Miss Wilkins. She looked startled, then turned her eyes toward Ethan. A moment later, she called out gently, "Ethan, sweetheart, there's someone here to see you." Ethan's heart jumped. Someone? For him? He slid off the bench, his shoes softly tapping on the tiled floor as he made his way across the room. The man smiled as he approached, a calm, careful smile that made Ethan both curious and nervous. "Hello, Ethan," the man said, his voice smooth and kind. "I'm Mr. Caldwell. I'm here on behalf of someone who's been searching for you." Ethan blinked, puzzled. "Searching for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who would be looking for me?" Mr. Caldwell's smile deepened, almost knowingly. "Your grandfather," he said gently, "has been trying to find you, and he'd very much like to meet you. He's invited you to dinner tomorrow evening." The words hit Ethan like a wave. Grandfather? He had never heard of any family. The orphanage had always told him his parents were gone, and no one had ever come forward to claim him. Not once. And now, out of nowhere, someone wanted to meet him. A million thoughts tumbled through his mind. He didn't know whether to be excited or scared. Seeing the conflict on his face, Mr. Caldwell spoke again. "I know this is unexpected, but your grandfather is eager to meet you. He's arranged a very special dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. And if you'd like, Miss Wilkins can come with you, just so you feel more comfortable." Ethan looked over at Miss Wilkins, who gave him a soft nod and a warm, encouraging smile. She had always been like a mother figure, gentle, patient, and quietly protective. Her smile said, "It's okay. You should go." Taking a deep breath, Ethan turned back to Mr. Caldwell. "I'd like to meet him," he said softly. The next day moved like molasses. Each hour crawled by as Ethan waited with nervous excitement. He wore his best clothes, a neat little outfit Miss Wilkins had saved for special moments. It wasn't much, but to Ethan, it felt like a suit of armor. He looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the boy staring back. When Mr. Caldwell finally arrived, he led Ethan to a sleek black car parked at the curb. The polished surface reflected the pink and orange hues of a setting sun like something out of a movie. Ethan climbed in quietly, heart pounding. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows. Ethan stared out the window, wondering what kind of man his grandfather was. Was he kind? Did he smile? Or was he serious and quiet like some of the adults Ethan had met before? The car pulled up in front of a grand restaurant. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Glass doors, glowing lights, people in suits and dresses. It was like something from one of his storybooks. Inside, the chandeliers shimmered above crisp white tablecloths, and the air was filled with a rich scent of foods he couldn't name. Mr. Caldwell led him to a table in the heart of the room. And there he was, an older man, tall and composed, with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen far more than they ever said. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, waiting. Ethan slowed, feeling suddenly small. This was his grandfather, the man who, until now, had been nothing but a question mark. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was a pause. Something flickered in his gaze. Was it sadness? Guilt? Something Ethan couldn't name. Ethan sat down quietly, his hands folded in his lap, feeling 1,000 emotions all at once. Hope, fear, wonder. He didn't know what would come next, but something in his heart told him everything was about to change. "Hello, Ethan," the man said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Edward, your grandfather." Ethan swallowed hard, managing a small nod. "Hello, sir," he replied softly, barely above a whisper. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They sat there, two strangers linked by blood but separated by years of silence. Ethan had imagined this moment so many times, filled with warmth, maybe even tears or hugs. But now that it was real, it felt cold, distant, like walking into a room expecting sunlight and finding shadows instead. Before he could think of what to say next, a server approached their table. The quiet tension lifted briefly as they were handed menus. Ethan glanced down, confused by the fancy names and unfamiliar dishes. He tried to read them, but the words felt foreign, like they belonged to another world. Noticing his hesitation, Edward signaled to the server and ordered for both of them, choosing dishes that sounded elaborate and expensive. Once the server walked away, Edward turned back to Ethan, offering a small, practiced smile. "I thought it was time we met," he said, his tone more like a business meeting than a family reunion. Ethan nodded again, still unsure what to say. The air between them felt thick, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was somehow disappointing the man sitting across from him. But deep inside, he held on to hope that by the end of the evening, this quiet, distant man might start to feel like family. Ethan looked around the restaurant, trying to ground himself. Everything about the place seemed unreal. The marble floors that sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers, the soft hush of well-dressed guests chatting politely over candlelit tables, the folded linen napkins, gleaming silverware, and delicate china plates reminded him of illustrations from books, not anything from his real life. He turned his eyes back to his grandfather, Edward Grayson. The name meant something in town. A man of influence, wealthy, respected. From his spotless white shirt to his perfectly tailored navy suit, every inch of him looked carefully assembled. But behind all the polish, his expression was unreadable, his eyes guarded, his mouth tight. When the server filled their water glasses and walked away, Ethan shifted in his seat. He had so many questions. Where had Edward been all these years? Why now? Why not sooner? But the questions felt too fragile to ask out loud. Trying instead to spark a connection, Ethan asked quietly, "So, do you come here a lot?" Edward looked up, mildly surprised by the question. "Yes," he said with a short nod. "It's a respectable place. I dine here from time to time." Ethan nodded, even though it didn't mean much to him. He could feel his grandfather's eyes studying him, measuring him, and he wished, more than anything, that this conversation would turn into something real, something human. So he tried again. "Do you like reading?" Ethan asked, searching for a shared interest. Edward's brows lifted slightly, as if the question had caught him off guard. "Reading," he repeated. "I read when necessary. Business reports, financial briefings, that sort of thing." "Oh." Ethan's voice fell. "I like reading stories, mostly. It helps me imagine being somewhere else sometimes." Edward gave a faint, polite smile, but said nothing more. The silence crept in again, heavier now. It became painfully clear to Ethan that his grandfather wasn't used to speaking with children, maybe had never even wanted to, and maybe Ethan wasn't who he expected to meet. Still, Ethan wasn't ready to give up. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Grayson," he said, offering a small smile. His grandfather's expression softened just a bit. He gave a quick nod. "You're welcome." It seemed appropriate, given the circumstances. Circumstances. Ethan echoed quietly. Edward hesitated. Then, in a clipped tone, said, "It was time. Families should know one another, even if Well, even if life doesn't always make that easy. The way he spoke, like this was a contract rather than a connection, made Ethan's chest ache. He wanted to ask why his grandfather had stayed away all these years, why he hadn't come sooner, but he was afraid it might sound ungrateful. So instead, he picked up his water glass and took a small sip, trying to calm the storm in his chest. The food arrived shortly after. Each plate looked like art, colorful, elegant, and completely unfamiliar. Ethan stared at the dish in front of him, unsure where to even start. Across the table, Edward dug in without hesitation, his knife and fork moving with practiced ease. The silence returned as they ate. Ethan felt like a guest in someone else's world, out of place, unsure and invisible. Still, his heart wouldn't let him quit. Do you have any stories about my mom or dad?" he asked softly, his eyes searching Edward's face. His voice barely carried across the table, but the yearning in it was unmistakable. Edward Grayson paused, his fork hovering midair. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of emotion, gone as quickly as it came. He glanced down at his plate, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, the mask of composure sliding back into place. "Some things are better left in the past." Ethan's heart sank. He had hope for stories, something, anything, that could help him feel connected to the parents he never got to know. But Edward's reply only made the distance between them feel even greater. Sitting in this beautiful restaurant, surrounded by glowing lights and elegant decor, Ethan felt more alone than ever. He poked at the food on his plate, barely tasting it. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly couple sitting at the table nearby. They were watching him, not in a rude way, but with soft, warm expressions. The woman gave Ethan a kind smile, and he managed to return it, just a little. That one simple gesture, small as it was, felt like a lifeline. The woman leaned toward him and said gently, "You've got a lovely smile. Young man, are you enjoying dinner with your grandfather?" Ethan looked down shyly and gave a polite nod. "Yes. Thank you." The couple exchanged a knowing glance. It was subtle, but they could feel the tension at Ethan's table. The woman turned back toward him with another smile. "Well, you look very handsome tonight," she said warmly. "I hope you're having a wonderful time." Something about her voice, soft, genuine, full of motherly kindness, melted the tightness in Ethan's chest. His smile, this time, was real. Edward cleared his throat, clearly noticing the interaction. He glanced at the couple with a polite but slightly disapproving look before turning his attention back to his meal. But for Ethan, that moment had stirred something brave inside him. Gathering his courage, he looked across the table and asked, "Grandpa, what's it like to be you, to live in a big house and have all this?" Edward looked up, caught off guard by the innocence of the question. He hesitated, then gave a measured reply. "It's busy," he said flatly. "There are always responsibilities." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to understand. He glanced around the grand dining room, the polished marble floors, the gentle clink of fine silverware, the chandelier lights flickering above. It was beautiful, yes, but also cold. Everything felt staged, controlled, and deep down, he wondered if any of it really made his grandfather happy. To Ethan, family meant warmth, laughter, and love. He didn't feel any of those things at this table. As the dinner dragged on, the silence between them grew heavier. The excitement Ethan had felt about meeting his grandfather was quietly fading, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. Edward was present in body, but not in heart. His focus seemed fixed on the structure of the evening, not the boy across from him. The couple nearby, however, had noticed. The woman had been quietly observing, her eyes softening every time she saw Ethan try to speak, only to be met with cold, half-hearted replies. She leaned slightly toward him again, her tone gentle. "Hello again, sweetheart," she said with a warm smile. "That's quite the sharp outfit you've got on tonight. You look very handsome." Ethan's cheeks flushed, and a wide grin spread across his face, one that had been hiding all evening. "Thank you," he replied shyly, glancing down at his neatly pressed shirt. That small kindness settled into his heart like a warm blanket. The woman nodded toward his plate. "How's the food? I always find it a bit fancy here. Don't you?" Ethan giggled softly. It's different, he admitted, trying not to sound rude but clearly relieved that someone else understood how strange it all felt. Her husband chuckled. Every time we come here, I say the same thing, he said with a grin. Some of this stuff looks too pretty to eat. Ethan laughed. Real, genuine laughter. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that night, he felt like he could breathe, like he was just Ethan, not a guest, not a burden, not someone to be evaluated. Edward glanced up again. He noticed how easily Ethan smiled with these strangers, how the boy's posture softened, how his eyes sparkled. He hadn't seen that version of his grandson all evening, and for the first time, something shifted inside him. He watched, quietly, as the couple brought Ethan out of his shell with nothing more than kindness and simple words. And the realization stung. Why had it taken strangers to draw that out of his own flesh and blood? Why couldn't he reach Ethan like that? As the friendly conversation continued, a young server approached their table to refill water glasses. He too had noticed Ethan, a small boy in too big clothes, seated stiffly across from a man who barely smiled. The server didn't say anything at first, but as he poured water into Edward's glass, he glanced down at Ethan and gave him a quiet nod and a kind grin. Ethan smiled back. That small connection, like all the others that night, was brief but powerful. It reminded Ethan that even though this dinner wasn't what he had hoped, he wasn't invisible. He was seen, and more importantly, he was valued. The server gave Ethan a kind nod as he refilled their glasses. "Good evening, young man," he said warmly. "We don't get many guests your age around here. You're quite the gentleman tonight." Ethan beamed, his heart lifting at the kindness. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. The server lingered a moment, glancing toward Edward Grayson. "You have a fine young man here, sir," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's the small things, like dinners like this, that make the biggest difference. These are the moments I remember most." His words, though spoken gently, struck Edward deeper than he expected. He had thought this dinner would be enough, that simply showing Ethan the grandeur of his world would somehow make up for the years of absence. But this stranger, in just a few quiet words, reminded him that real family wasn't built on fine dining or expensive surroundings. It was built on heart, on attention, on being present. Edward's gaze drifted to Ethan, who was now fully engaged in conversation with a couple at the next table. Mrs. Jacobson was telling a funny story about her own son's first day of school, and Ethan laughed, a real, joyful laugh. His posture was relaxed, his eyes were bright. In those moments, surrounded by warmth and curiosity, Ethan had come alive in a way he hadn't all evening. Edward realized something he had never truly considered. This is what matters to him. Not the suit, not the restaurant, not the display, the connection, the being seen, the being heard. Throughout the rest of the dinner, the Jacobsons continued to include Ethan in their light-hearted conversation. They asked him about the things he loved, his drawings, his favorite books, the places he dreamed of visiting. And Ethan spoke freely, his nervousness melting away. His eyes sparkled as he described imaginary cities and castles he had sketched late at night by the orphanage window. Mrs. Jacobson smiled gently at him and said, "You have a bright spirit, Ethan. I can see it in your smile, in the way you talk about the world. Don't ever lose that light, okay?" Ethan's chest swelled with warmth. Her words felt like a gift, a quiet confirmation that he mattered, just as he was. Edward watched all of this carefully, the weight of it settling heavily in his chest. He couldn't deny it. The kindness of strangers had done what he himself had failed to do all evening. They had seen Ethan. They had drawn him out. They had made him feel cherished. And Edward began to question, truly question, the life he had built around himself. Was it all just walls? Layers of formality and pride that had shut out the things that truly mattered? The dinner began to wind down, but the Jacobsons were not done leaving their mark. Mrs. Jacobson turned to Edward, offering a kind but meaningful smile. "You have a wonderful grandson," she said softly. "He has a big heart. These moments, they matter more than you might think. Please, don't let them pass you by." Edward gave a small nod. Her words lingered in the air, pressing gently but firmly against the hardened edges of his heart. For the first time, he wondered if maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, Just maybe there was still time to build something real. The server's voice from earlier echoed in his mind. These are the moments they'll remember most. All his life, Edward had measured success in numbers, in assets, in status. But here, sitting across from his grandson who laughed so freely with strangers, Edward felt those things pale in comparison to the quiet riches of connection. He cleared his throat, suddenly breaking the silence between them. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, warmer. "I'd like to hear more about those places you draw. Maybe," he paused, hesitant but sincere, "maybe we could see them together one day." Ethan looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. It was the first time that evening he had seen a crack in his grandfather's careful armor, a glimpse of something tender, something hopeful. Ethan's voice was small but steady. "I'd like that," he whispered, his heart swelling with gratitude. As they stepped out of the restaurant into the cool night air, something had shifted between them. Edward Grayson, walking alongside Ethan, felt as though he had taken the first step toward truly knowing his grandson, not as an obligation, not as a distant responsibility, but as family. And Ethan felt it too, the warmth, the glimmer of possibility. The kindness of strangers at night had done more than offer friendly words. It had opened a door neither of them had expected. Without realizing it, they had both begun writing the first page of a new chapter. A chapter where the greatest wealth was not in what was owned, but in what was shared, in memories, in laughter, in love. As they walked together, a quiet but powerful understanding settled between them. Sometimes the smallest gestures can change everything. "Sometimes," Ethan said softly, his eyes cast downward, "I'd imagine someone would come for me, that I'd wake up one day and have a family waiting, a place where I really belonged." His voice cracked, and he gave a small, awkward laugh to hide the emotion behind his words. "I guess that sounds kind of silly." Mrs. Jacobson shook her head firmly, her own eyes beginning to glisten. "No, Ethan," she said gently, "it doesn't sound silly at all. Wanting a family, a place to belong, is something everyone deserves." Across the table, Edward Grayson felt something shift deep within him. Her words cut through the polished shell he'd worn for years. The distance he had kept from Ethan, the assumption that dinner at a fine restaurant, surrounded by grandeur, could somehow replace real connection, now felt empty, painfully shallow. He had convinced himself that their worlds were too different, that his life of status and structure couldn't possibly mesh with a child raised in an orphanage. But now, listening to Ethan's quiet longing, Edward saw himself clearly for the first time, and all that he had missed. Ethan fidgeted with a napkin in his lap, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to draw pictures of families, little homes with gardens, people sitting together at dinner." His eyes stayed low, distant. "I'd pretend I was there with them, even if it was just pretend." The room seemed to still, his words hanging in the air like fragile glass. Even the waitstaff, moving silently between tables, paused as fragments of Ethan's voice reached their ears. Edward's heart ached, truly ached. Every year he had spent ignoring the boy's existence, every excuse he made about timing or circumstance, came crashing down on him. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm he had created. But for a long moment, there were no words. Finally, Ethan looked up, his expression open and hesitant. "I don't know why you wanted to meet me now, Mr. Grayson," he said quietly, though his voice didn't tremble. "But I'm glad you did, even if it's just for tonight." That simple truth shattered the last of Edward's defenses. Ethan wasn't asking for anything extravagant. He wasn't demanding answers or explanations. All he wanted was to belong, to be seen, even just for a moment. It was Mrs. Jacobson who gently reached across the table and placed a hand on Edward's. Her voice was soft but steady, filled with the kind of empathy only someone who truly understands can offer. "Family is precious," she said, "and it's never too late to make things right. You still have a chance to be what he's dreamed of, what he deserves, and that's worth more than anything money could ever buy." Her words rang in Edward's chest like a bell. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape what came next. That decision, that choice, lay in his hands now. Summoning the courage he had always lacked in matters of the heart, Edward reached out, placing a hesitant but sincere hand on Ethan's small shoulder. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, half in shock, half in hope. Ethan, Edward said, his voice trembling for the first time in decades. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not being there, for not realizing how much you needed this, how much I needed this too. He paused, trying to swallow past the tightness in his throat. I don't expect you to understand why I waited so long. But if you'll let me, I want to change that now. I want to be the family you've been waiting for. Ethan's face began to soften. His shoulders, once tense and uncertain, relaxed just a little. Really? He asked, barely above a whisper. Yes, Edward said, the words pouring from a place he hadn't known existed in himself. I can't change the past, but I'd like to start right now, if you'll let me. A tear slipped down Ethan's cheek, but he smiled through it, a smile so pure it lit his entire face. I'd like that very much. Grandpa. A hush seemed to fall over the table, the kind of silence filled not with absence, but with peace. The Jacobsons exchanged knowing smiles, their hearts full. What they had witnessed that night went far beyond good manners or polite conversation. It was something sacred, something healing. Edward Grayson, for the first time in his life, understood what truly mattered. Not the tailored suit, not the high-rise office, not the private account balances, but the small hand now clasped in his, and the young heart beside him that had chosen to trust him anyway. As they stepped out of the restaurant into the crisp night air, Edward felt Ethan's hand tighten in his. He looked down at the boy he had nearly lost forever, and knew that this was the beginning of something that couldn't be bought or traded. A bond not forged in blood alone, but in choice, humility, and love. The two walked side by side down the quiet sidewalk, their footsteps light against the pavement. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt it, not a dream, not a drawing, but something real. He felt home. And Edward, once blinded by success, now understood. The greatest fortune he would ever hold was walking beside him. Leo's heart swelled, his eyes shimmering with disbelief and joy. This was the moment he had dreamed about in the quiet corners of his mind. And now, standing here, it was even more beautiful than he had dared to imagine. Roger gently continued, his voice soft and unsteady, his own eyes misty. If you'll let me, he said, I want to be there for you from now on. Not just a grandfather in name, not someone who shows up once and disappears, but someone who's there for the long haul, every step of the way. Leo didn't need to think. Without a word, he rushed forward and wrapped his arms tightly around Roger. Not just a hug, but an outpouring of years of longing, of unspoken hopes finally being answered. Roger pulled him in just as tightly, holding the boy like he never wanted to let go again. In that embrace, neither of them felt alone anymore. The cold, empty places in their hearts began to fill, not with riches or luxury, but with something far more lasting, love. As they pulled apart, Roger rested a hand on Leo's small shoulder and looked him in the eye, his expression lighter, his purpose clear. Let's build memories together, Leo, he said with a quiet smile. Just you and me. Let's do things that matter, not just for us, but for others, too. From that moment on, Roger and Leo weren't just family by blood. They became family by heart. They made new memories, the kind Leo used to draw in his sketchbooks. Roger took him fishing by the lake, where they laughed more than they caught fish. They hiked mountain trails and camped under starry skies. On rainy days, they stayed in with hot cocoa and chess games, or just talked for hours about life, about dreams, about nothing and everything. The big, quiet mansion that once echoed with silence slowly came to life. Fridge doors now held Leo's sketches. Photo frames captured their silly moments, and the halls filled with laughter. But it didn't stop there. One afternoon, after reading to each other in the sunroom, Leo turned to Roger and said, "What if we helped other kids like me? The ones still waiting?" Roger paused, then nodded. Together, they began visiting local orphanages. At first, they brought gifts, but over time, they brought more, their time, their stories, their presence. Roger read books to the little ones, while Leo sat on the floor sketching dreams with them. They played games, answered questions, and more importantly, they listened. These small acts, done together, transformed Roger's life in ways even he hadn't expected. For the first time, his wealth wasn't just in bank accounts. It was in laughter, in hugs, in the impact they left behind. He had spent decades building a business empire. But now, he was building something greater, a legacy of compassion. Years passed. Leo grew into a young man full of warmth and quiet strength. He became someone others naturally gravitated toward, confident, kind, and grounded in the love he had finally received. Roger watched with pride as his grandson became everything he had once hoped for, and more. And though Roger's hair turned whiter and his pace slower, his heart had never been fuller. One late spring afternoon, they stood side by side in the courtyard of a familiar orphanage. Children ran around them, laughing, calling Leo's name, tugging on Roger's coat for more stories. The sun bathed everything in a golden hue. Roger turned to Leo, his eyes glistening. "I think," he said, "this is the happiest I've ever been." Leo smiled. "Me too, Grandpa." And in that moment, surrounded by the sound of laughter, the warmth of love, and the faces of children who now had hope, Roger finally understood. He hadn't just found his grandson. He had found his purpose. He had found home. Sometimes a family we need isn't found, it's chosen. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with a single act of kindness, a meal shared, a hand held, a heart opened. Roger thought he had everything, but it took a quiet boy with a sketchbook and a dream to show him what truly matters. Because in the end, the richest lives are not measured by how much we own, but by how much we give, the love we share, the memories we leave behind. This is a legacy that lasts, and it begins with choosing love, one moment at a time.